Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first interview for the course Media Migration. Today, I'm very happy that I have with me my great colleague, but also great scholar in the field, Dr. Koen Leurs. He's an assistant professor in gender and post-colonial studies in the Department of Media and Culture at Utrecht University. Not only that, Koen, he's also the chair of the European Communication Research and Education, ECREA, specifically the Diaspora, Migration and Media section. And at this moment, currently he's a fellow at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies, where he's writing his book called Digital Migration. The book is under contract with Sage at the moment, and it's precisely about the book where I'm very, very curious to learn more about the developments. But first, Koen, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
So Koen, you have been doing pioneering work on developing the new field of research, as I said, the field of digital migration studies. And you've been developing already a lot of different projects in relation to this topic, and more specifically now you're writing a book about it. Can you tell us what is this emerging research field mainly about?
Sure, maybe I'll start doing that by showing. So to just give you an idea, so the idea of the book, which is in the title Digital Migration, is to offer a reflection and kind of state of the art, but also a reflection on how to do research on the digitization of migration. And for me, I felt an urgency to do so, seeing like really a large proliferation of studies looking at migration from various disciplines, including media and communication, but also, for example, refugee studies, anthropology, geography, and tech studies, exactly on this relationship between new digital innovative technologies and how they were changing migration. So for me, it comes down to three or maybe four interesting kind of questions that relate to how we can understand the digital migration, how we can understand the new configurations, which have to do with questions of ontology, about the very essence of how we can understand our changing world by focusing on the digital and on migration and their intersections, the various new questions and kind of disciplinary orientations that they trigger, as well as new kind of exciting but also sometimes worrying opportunities to do new types of research. So there's new data which can be studied in new formats, which also I would say demands us to reconsider and engage with ethical questions. So about this, the idea of the question around ontology really comes from, I'm just now briefly explaining what I mean by ontology, epistemology, and methods ethics. So the question around ontology, so around the question of how we understand our world in its essence and its transformations, comes from this understanding that we see large-scale transformations in terms of our society changing and evolving as a result of larger scales of migration, but also increasing digitization. And at the intersections of those, we see a lot of new concepts and ideas emerging. Concepts like the connected migrant, connected refugee, digital diaspora, mediatization of migration, communications and mobility. A lot of new terms that seek to grapple with these changing changes in our society. And when we see that, so this is happening indeed within academia, a lot of people are trying to address these transformations, large-scale transformations, but also, for example, in the humanitarian sector. So these are just a few of the different reports that UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has published in recent years, usually working together with tech partners to chart the practical on-the-ground implications. So, for example, new means of reaching a targeted population, of service provision, etc. So what are kind of the new opportunities and risks in this area? So this was about the sense of ontological transformation. When we now talk about the second level of more questions around epistemology, I took here cues from a paper written by Joseph Dumit, and he was a teaching assistant for the feminist technoscience scholar Donna Haraway, who is a philosopher of science, but considers questions of power in the history and philosophy of science. And in her lectures, she used to challenge students by researching together simple objects. For example, a student would come in with a cup of coffee and invite the student to reflect on the many different perspectives and dimensions to understanding how power was at play in the production of this cup of coffee. And similarly, I've taken this approach in reflecting on all the many different dimensions, perspective, analytic lenses, epistemological perspectives thus, to research what was going on exactly here, what's going on exactly in this kind of emerging discussion across fields on the digitization of migration. So here we can address this question from the side of political science. We can look at how it's specifically contextualized and situated in the global north. We can look at how digital migration is described in different forms of texts, how it is lived in, for example, migrant bodies or government actors' bodies. There are specific histories to the digitization of migration. So, for example, the introduction of technologies to control, monitor, and govern populations has a long, long history within colonialism, but also, for example, under the Holocaust, to name a few kind of extremes. So there are many different dimensions to unpack, and in the book, I'm trying to address the different kind of ontological questions, but also the questions around how we can come to an understanding in many different ways in understanding this relation between digitization and migration. And a final, maybe this is a bit overwhelming. The third point that I want to make, I try to make sense of this, is exactly this question around methodology, that it offers new and challenging ways, or new ways to understand migration and mobility. There are new forms of data coming from the use of social media among migrants, but also the digitization of borders, for example, by government agencies. So there is data, large-scale data, small-scale data. What should we do with this as researchers? That's, I think, an urgent question.
Koen, that's this holistic perspective on trying to understanding the digitalization phenomenon in migration from different perspectives. It's, as you said, it's quite an urgent question, and it's a complex one. And I was particularly intrigued by when you're saying the epistemology of the field, right? And the importance of looking at it from different perspectives. And you raised the perspective on power. So, but also trying to take on from what you just said, how do you envision the positionality of, how are you conceptualizing, how can you discuss the positionality of different actors in relation to technology appropriations or in relation to the way they imagine technologies, to make sense of how the field is organized or is developing, actually?
The question of how to consider this relationship between digitalization and migration, and also this question around power. I think it's urgent indeed, as you say, to take into account the role of different stakeholders. because the thinking and production of knowledge on the relationship between the two doesn't come from one actor. So we, me myself as a researcher, among all our colleagues, are only one of the voices in this arena of knowledge production. And here on the slide, I've just put a distinguish between 8 actors that all have a say in shaping knowledge production in this contested arena. So we see, for example, how a second group of actors are government agencies, such as the European Union, Frontex, Border Patrol, and different, for example, digital databases mobilized, all produce a specific understanding of the migrant, which is usually based on datafication and on biometrics. The third group of actors are what we can understand as the industry of migrant connectivity. So companies, mobile phone companies like Lebara, providing specific services for migrants to keep in touch across distance. The fourth group, and this is a headline by a Dutch newspaper, exactly refers to the group of journalists that also produce narratives about digitization and migration, alongside the fifth group, which are humanitarian agencies, the sixth group, social media users, so everyday people expressing their opinions, and also specifically framing migration and increasingly also drawing on the digital as a way of making sense of this discourse. The seventh group of actors here, we see the artist Ai Weiwei reenacting the death of Alan Kurdi, who drowned and washed ashore at the coast of Bodrum in Turkey. And this is an artistic intervention in this discourse on migration and migration at the border of Europe. The 8 are icons of activist and solidarity groups embracing digital means to work with refugee communities, to assist refugee communities. And then the 8th group are refugees themselves who insert themselves, for example, through selfies. Here we see Anais Modami taking a selfie with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in a refugee camp in Berlin. So here also refugees themselves insert themselves in the discourse in how the digital and migration are imagined.
Could you maybe give us some examples about the challenges related to using data for research, but also investigating the field through the different possibilities of data that you mentioned before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a very urgent question and very difficult to answer because there's no one answer to the question. And it really boils down to the different disciplinary foci that scholars have in addressing this question. But I can give you an overview, at least, of how I'm trying to make sense of this question. For example, when you see the kind of history of how this debate has unfolded, we see that across different fields that there has been a kind of dialectic between people who have taken a migrant-centric perspective versus people who've taken a digital media-centric perspective. So from the 1990s onwards, the kind of early studies on migrant connectivity, on social media use and forum use, for example, homepage creation among migrants, these were really focused on how the digital was a kind of new place for identity exploration. So really taking the digital as a central point of analysis. So not necessarily looking at the migrant in her situated context, but looking at the digital as a way of knowledge production. So discussion forums, which were very popular in those days, were taken as a kind of proxy to understand questions around migration and mobility. as represented by migrants themselves. A second kind of answer to this focus on the digital we saw from the early 2000s onwards were more anthropological and ethnographic approaches, which tried to situate kind of the experiences of digital technology through looking at how people relate to technologies in the online and offline context. So a famous study there is Miller and Slater, who studied Trinidadians in Trinidad as well as in the diaspora. And in their work, they famously state, if you want to get to the internet, you shouldn't start there in your study. So you should start with the people. So this was around the 2000s to around 2010, after which we again see a turn away from the migrant to the digital, so more digital-centric kind of perspective, where people have embraced more data-driven approaches. So with the abundance of migration data traces on social media, but also in other databases, people are trying to look and understand migration patterns by looking at data points and aggregating data points to understand migration rather than starting from the individual or from the community of migrants to understand their practices. So there's a kind of wave movement in how we see the focus of people evolving. And there's no, I think there's no really consensus about what's the best way to pursue studies, rather than people more and more suggesting to combine approaches. So not only start from the digital, but include people's everyday meaning-making practices, but also don't shy away from kind of big data approaches, which kind of give you a sense of patterns and larger scale questions, which you can also use for rallying or challenging injustice, for example.
But I must assume, of course, in the case, in a sense of when it comes to big data and migration, it's almost impossible to think of or making sense of that without also looking at the context, the spatial nature, right, of the data. It's still, it's still needed. It's important to combine both perspectives. Is that something you're also trying to do, trying to discuss that in your book?
Yeah, for sure, because I think, and this is another kind of crucial point, indeed, when seeing that there's a possibility to conduct studies on the basis of large-scale data sets, this is, I think, a privilege which particularly holds for researchers based in the global north that have resources and the labs to pursue this kind of work. So when we in the global north, in Western Europe, in the US, in Australia, pursue this kind of work, you can also say that there's a perpetuation of inequalities, as the kind of resources required to pursue this work. So to make sense of data traces by people, largely volunteered by people coming from the global south to the global north, without their say in this process, is another form of extraction. And it creates larger power differences between academics in the south and in the north in terms of who has access to resources. And I think on a more meta level, this also raises a lot of questions about how, since it's kind of fashionable and attractive and vogue to do data research, big data research, what does this mean if we turn to big data? Does it mean that we turn away from the more ethnographic, anthropological perspectives, which bring a kind of human face to migration? At least there's a potential for doing so. I think there's a big risk also for us to face as researchers, as we embrace these new possibilities. I think it also comes with new questions of accountability.
Mm. Yeah, and ethics, yeah, as you just mentioned. And also the issue of representativeness, right? And as you described, the disparities. And speaking about that, Koen, you've also been constantly claiming about this, the importance of knowledge production coming from the so-called global South countries. and that the field itself still needs more contributions from perspectives that are not produced in Western countries or countries in the global North. So we've seen, of course, I think probably over the past 3-4 years, and emerging trends in relation to fieldwork studies, but also more data, right, about what's going on in countries where migration flows are predominant, right? And what do you attribute these barriers to? What are the main issues? I think you just mentioned now something, of course, very important related to data, but also more generally, how can you describe the main barriers related to knowledge production coming from researchers, but also when it comes to data from in contexts where migration is actually predominant?
Yeah, I think this question of accountability and reflexivity is super important. It's difficult, particularly because it asks from researchers to reflect on their own assumptions. For example, conceptual assumptions, methodological and ethical assumptions. And I think a first question here is indeed, what is our role as academics? How are we also involved and complicit in the migration industry? So, for example, when Europe-based researchers conduct research on borders, for example, to what extent do they, by doing research on bordering practices, also themselves reinforce or legitimate those practices of, for example, bordering? What if our epistemology is based on the nation state, for example, researching migration to European nation states? To what extent do we reinforce and legitimate this sense of Europe as a fortress, which somehow needs to be protected against incoming flows from the global south? I think that's a very legitimate concern that merits much more reflection. The same holds for categories. Like we as researchers very often have the power of definition, of deciding how to name people, how to label people. And these labels are never neutral. For example, terms like migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, or expatriates, they are like out there in public discourse, but they also have, really indicate sharp hierarchies of power. So when we use specific categories, we also reinforce and legitimate them. So I think we should also be very cautious of this, almost kind of fetishistic use of labels. So when we now know that kind of refugee research is becoming more and more popular, more and more funded, we should also be critical of how our work is being used in Europe, for example, to legitimate the European migration policies. So how does research on kind of producing data, which, for example, predicts migration flows on the basis of how people use social media, I think it's urgent to ask ourselves this question: should we be doing this? And how can our work be appropriated also for non-beneficial purposes?
Koen, you have also, I'm already really exceeding the time, but the conversation is going very nicely. You've also been, over the past 5 years, if I'm not wrong, conducting research with expat and refugee youth and across different cities in the Netherlands. And you've been particularly focusing on smartphone usage among these different populations. And you've been constantly cautious and careful about the potential of smartphones, not only for uses, functional uses, but also for claiming rights, for political mobilization, for communication rights. And you also address and highlight the paradoxes that emerge through these uses. because of these uses and from these uses. So could you tell us a bit more about what are these paradoxical roles of the smartphone? How does that intersect with the lives of the people you've been in contact and collaborating with throughout these years?
Sure, perhaps for the sake of not boring people too much, I'll try to maybe visualize that. Yeah, around this question of paradoxes and how we can engage in kind of reflective knowledge production with smartphones. In my work with young refugees and young expatriates, I've developed this approach of you can call it a scroll back method. So during interviews with young people, I've asked them to reflect on their experiences, for example, their journeys, but also experiences in the Netherlands by taking out their phones and scrolling back to look, for example, in their photo archive, but also in their archive on social media platforms as a way to kind of reflect, have young people reflect on the basis of media that they've produced themselves about their own experience of belonging, of non-belonging, of identity, and discrimination, racism, for example. And here I find always very powerful and striking this post by Amani, which shows a painting that she made, which depicts herself being in a situation of schizophrenia, as how she describes herself as schizophrenic position. So she reaches out, extends her arm into the unknown, while she also feels very much pulled back. And this is her, how she described her situation as being in between the different pools of different communities. So for example, she maintains still ties with families and friends still living in Syria, the diaspora, the Syrian diaspora, with specific gender norms, and then how here in the Netherlands, settling down, meeting new friends, but also experiencing new and other cultured and gendered expectations, where she negotiates the sense of being autonomous over deciding over her own life versus what is expected from her parents, from her family and friends. So this is a kind of indication of her feeling schizophrenic, which is also, for example, reflected in how she maintains multiple profiles on social media. So one directed at peers here in the Netherlands, one directed at family and friends, and she keeps those audiences distant from each other. So there's one side of herself that she shows, and another side that she shows to her family. And this is, I think, a very productive way to bring out those paradoxes, those tensions, also from the viewpoint of informants themselves, as a kind of way to elicit meaning making.
In a country, in the Netherlands, and we know that everyone has a different experience. We're all struggling. But how do you think that in this particular moment, what is your perspective on the way these youth, refugee youth, are experiencing this moment, and how digital technologies are playing a role in this process, in this crucial moment?
Yeah, I think what is maybe two quick remarks. One is when you were mentioning crisis, I first also thought about the global political crisis and the US elections. And what I always found so striking to realize that when I started fieldwork in 2015-16, me and most of my academic colleagues were fully confident about who the new US president would be. And only my fieldwork participants, young refugees, would always prove or would always be very confident in stating, no, it would definitely be Trump being elected. And that happened. So it also says something about us as academics being in a sort of social media bubble with perhaps not always the best feelings on the ground. And second, regarding the health pandemic, what we see, I think, all across Europe, and most strikingly in the European islands, or Egypt islands in Greece, in many of the refugee camps that have been hard hit by corona measures. So we've seen camps being closed for extended periods of time. We've seen the horrible fires in Moria camp in Lesbos, where people are now still living lives in complete misery. And I think partly because of the health pandemic, this the refugee crisis and massive death at sea is has almost fallen from the public agenda and public our news agenda too. So I think that's an important reminder. And in the case of Netherlands and young refugees here trying to make do, I think that the first lockdown in Netherlands with schools closing was particularly a challenging time, as people who are still living either in refugee camps or trying to set up a new life in social housing, for example. Their lives were at a complete standstill, like everybody, like all our lives in Netherlands were, but they were particularly hard hit because also they were like their means of participation, like learning Dutch, were also suspended. And we have seen that the waiting lists and the bureaucratic procedures also being completely frozen. So waiting times for people have become indefinite in asylum procedures, but also in family reunification, for example. So these are, I think, just illustrations of how crisis situations very often also increasingly hit even harder marginalized groups.
On the other hand, of course, the situation is indeed in different and diverse refugee contexts and diverse contexts where we've seen here in the Netherlands a lot of uncertainty also in relation to asylum, as you just mentioned, asylum applications, but also their legal situation and plans that have been made, right? But at the same time, there have also been a lot of solidarity actions, right? And the different communities also this became sort of like the norm at this moment. People from with a refugee background, the refugee community itself, migrant communities trying to provide information, but also different forms of assistance to be able to mitigate the impact somehow during this period.
Yeah, I think, well, for sure, the point of information about the health pandemic also creating an information pandemic. We also saw how, like, early research on information practices, we saw that, like, the circulation of fake news on corona was also particularly adamant among refugee groups. But we also saw how internal to migrant groups, people also sought to push back against these situations of misinformation. So I think exactly it's really important to take this agency-centric perspective. Like, it's not only all bleak and devastating and harsh, but there is always also room for contestation, which is important to draw our attention to.
Well, thank you very much, Koen, again.
Thanks for having me. Hope this was useful to everyone. And please do reach out if you have any additional questions, concerns, critiques. I'm very happy to engage.